Gresham College presents Values and Value in the Marketplace by Lord Green, Minister of State for Trade and Investment.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and again, a very warm welcome to our series. As you know, we're discussing vision and values in a volatile world, and it's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce Lord Green, Stephen Green, to us this evening. Stephen has been a good friend for many years, and I'm delighted that he has agreed to come and be with us this evening. He is the Minister of State for Trade and Investment in the government, has got a huge portfolio of travelling around the world and encouraging people to invest in the country, explaining why it is that we believe that this is a great place to do business. So he travels enormously. Before that, as some of you will know, he was chairman of HSBC, which is one of the world's leading banks. And I think, if I may say that during the great crisis, I remember very vividly, well before the crisis, talking to him in his wonderful office in Canary Wharf, in which he was beginning to say that this situation has really overheated and that action has been taken by the bank to put it in a good position should something happen. None of us knew what was going to happen. I'm sure even Stephen would have doubted just how severe what actually did happen occurred, but unlike many other banks, it was in a very good position to be able to weather what was clearly one of the most difficult financial crises that we've talked about before. Stephen was educated at Exeter College in Oxford, went to MIT, worked for McKinsey before that, and has an amazing range both of interests and of qualifications. He has written a number of books, the first being Serving God, Serving Mammon. I must tell you that they have question marks after them. It's not a statement of his service, but most recently, Good Value. And Good Value is a book that I can highly recommend you to read. I enjoyed it enormously. It has a series of very well argued and crafted points of view, some of which you'll all be familiar with because we've been dealing with some of the issues that we have been talking about. You're talking about the ethics of globalization, personal responsibility, social progress. Those issues that we have tried to grapple with as we've talked about the values that are so important for our market economy to be able to thrive. And so he wrestles in the book with the demands of individual responsibility and the market, set in a broader economic and historical context. His ambition is to make the case for globalization as inevitable and progressive force and as a human phenomenon with all the qualifications of an underpinning of the values. Looking at the positives, he says, human cross-cultural fertilization and enrichment, the delivery of economic development around the world, higher productivity, and in recent times, globalization has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, particularly in China and India. And these benefits are material, they are spiritual, and they are cultural. It is a very wide brief that he takes when writing in the book, touching on all the themes that he's so very well qualified to speak about. The themes of finance, where he reached the top of his profession as a banker, and the themes of ethics and spirituality, which he has thought about, which he was implementing at the time, and the way in which he has given us this range as I said, of thought-provoking questions. He is a German scholar, so there's lots of Goethe about, and I'm sure that we might have one or two of them thrown in. But I particularly enjoyed, whilst reading the book, his extensive use of T.S. Eliot, to which he is repeatedly referring. So in Stephen Green, we do have not just a Minister of State, or indeed a banker, or indeed somebody who has written a book, but somebody who has drawn together those threads to pull a narrative together that I hope will enable us to navigate through some of the complexities of the world that we're facing. Stephen will speak to us, and then he'll be delighted to answer any questions. Stephen, come and join us.
Ken, well, thank you for those distinctly too generous words of introduction. My theme for the night is about value and values in the global market, and it does seek to kind of elaborate on some of those ambiguities and complexities that Ken has just been referring to. We're 4 years into the economic and financial crisis to which Ken has just referred. And capitalism is, of course, on trial in a way that I think we might say it has not been since the war, at any rate. In itself, this is not a new thought, not really. For much of the time over the last couple of hundred years, there's been a fair amount of ambivalence about the economic and social system with which we live. And in the wake of the crisis, there have, of course, been plenty of reviews and soul-searching about what happened and what lessons are supposed to be learned. Many of those lessons are very technical, long discussions about how financial supervision failed and what needs to be done to put that right, and so on. Discussions about the question of the stability of the financial system and whether that's intrinsic or avoidable, questions of the role that taxation ought to play, etc., etc. And I'm not really going to dwell on those tonight. I want tonight to be unashamedly more philosophical, or attempt to be unashamedly more philosophical about some of the issues that underlie the crisis and indeed some of the other great trends that I think are underway in the world. And the summary heading for it that I've chosen is about the relationship of values to value. One might even talk about the relationship of value to price as a subset of the issues. For after all, almost no one really thinks that price is the only good measure of value. Think of the way we use the words, indeed. Think of the words priceless and worthless. Something that's of immense worth we describe as priceless. Something that's cheap to the point of being extremely trivial we describe as worthless. And yet some things that are obviously of immense worth are in fact free. The air that we breathe, at least at the point of use, the water we drink. Other things that are free, or at least can't be bought, are immensely costly. Take, for example, selfless human love. And so, one way or another, there's a considerable ambiguity about what we mean by value and values. And so there are two questions that I want to dwell on particularly for the next few minutes or so. Firstly, should we have faith in the value of the global marketplace in human development? And secondly, can we maintain our values in the midst of a global marketplace which seems to value only what can be priced? And my answer to the first one is yes and no. And my answer to the second one is yes, but. And let me go on to explain. First then, should we put our trust in the global market as a, or even the, most effective engine of human, social and economic development the world has ever known? 5 years ago, BC, before the crisis, one might say, there were not many, or at any rate not enough people, even asking this question. The global economy was doing very well. The headline growth figures for the world economy were the strongest that they had been for decades. The new economies of Asia had come out of their crisis of the late 1990s with a renewed strength and were rapidly transforming themselves into modern urban societies. The world's centre of gravity was shifting eastwards and southwards to some extent. Hundreds of millions of people, as Ken has already mentioned, had been freed from poverty by making things that the rich world wanted to buy and doing so in vast amounts. World trade was growing. A new middle class was emerging globally. And in the famous phrase of Thomas Friedman, who wrote that blockbuster of a book, The Flat Earth, the world was becoming flat. Digital connectivity and the global marketplace seemed to offer progress without limit. Not, of course, that this was the New Jerusalem, or at least not yet. There was still clearly a long way to go. Even the most ideologically committed free marketeer would have acknowledged, before we could say that we were anywhere near the point where all of humanity had been set free and carried along in this great mainstream of change. But still, the direction of travel was clear, and maybe the towers of New Jerusalem were already to be seen on the horizon. How things have changed. We went very near the cliff edge in 2008, 2009. And indeed, in some ways, we still seem to be a little more uncomfortably near it than we would like, as the world worries about unsustainable debt burdens, about the Eurozone, about weak growth, about stubborn unemployment. 4 years into the crisis, we're still fretting about whether we've learned all of the right lessons from it. Is the consumer still too indebted? Why aren't big companies investing more? When are the Chinese going to compete on a level playing field? Do banks have enough capital? Are the financial markets properly regulated now? And so on. And beneath all these kinds of questions, something that I would suggest is even more fundamental. Are we not searching our souls, agonizing over the question, what is globalization doing to us? The evidence of change is all around, of course, and all the more stunning if viewed in a historical context. If you think about it, globalization's most important characteristic is urbanization, a process which is intrinsically connected with commerce and with globalization. When we ask what globalization is doing to us as human beings, we are in effect asking, to a considerable extent, what is urbanization doing to us as human beings? Now, cities have been in existence from the earliest recorded human history, almost. Their expansion, both absolutely and as a percentage of the whole population, is a phenomenon that began in the 19th century. It accelerated in the 20th and has become the overwhelming force of growth and social change in the 21st century. From about the year 2008, more than half of the world's population lives in cities. Virtually all future population growth will take place in big cities, particularly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Globally, the world's urban population will reach something like 70% of the world's total population by 2050, around 6 billion, which is almost as much as the whole population of the world just 10 years ago. In a sense, we're all too familiar with this. We're too close to it. And we need to draw breath and step back and appreciate the sheer enormity of what is happening through this process to the human species, to the human experience. Both China and India, the two great behemoths amongst the emerging markets, are only about halfway through at most in a process of migration from rural to urban life, which is creating hundreds of new conurbations. But everywhere in the developing world, the story is essentially the same. Urban populations will double, with profound economic, social, political, cultural, and psychological implications. It's underway, and it's not stoppable. Cities are the very embodiment of the human drive for connectedness, for wealth, for convenience, for stimulation. What do people want when they arrive in these vastly expanding conglomerations of the developing world? Well, the answer is they want the same things that we all want. Air conditioners, fridges, flat screen TVs, cars, fast food, designer clothes, etc., etc. They also want liberation from old rural structures, and they want to belong. It's a mixed blessing, to say the least. Along with the freedoms and the potential of individualization come the anxieties of atomization, in which support systems vanish and to each his own becomes both a promise and a threat. The result is that people form countless new and intricate webs, which seem to acquire a new life force. And increasingly, of course, these webs of connectivity extend from one city to another, to that extent at least, Thomas Friedman was right, and around the world. At their best, these webs bring about wonderfully enriching cultural exchanges. I remember 2 or 3 years ago being at a music festival in China, in Beijing, where an extremely well-known Chinese pianist, Lang Lang in fact, who's become known on a world scale since then, was playing what I think was for the first time, or certainly for the first time in a very public and prominent way, Brahms's first piano concerto, before all of the, or much of the establishment of Beijing. It was a remarkable experience to be at. The sheer power of that piece of music heard for the very first time in a place as sophisticated as China with its own ancient culture. Much more recently than that, I was in Qatar, in the Middle East, and went to the beautiful new Islamic Art Museum there, which in one of its major exhibition centres was holding an exhibition of Rembrandt paintings. Again, the effect of that there. And I could go on, of course. Around the world, on the positive side of things, globalization is connecting up and enriching people's experiences in a quite remarkable way. It's not all, of course, about classical music and classical art. It's also about sport. There are 15 million Manchester United fans in Vietnam, and so on. At their worst, cities are something different, aren't they? They are cauldrons of crime and flashpoints of terror. One way or another, cities are hotbeds of popular movement, hard for the authorities to deal with. This is a common feature of urban life. From very early on, the Romans understood this. The initials SPQR, Senatus Populusque Romanus, that still appear all over Roman buildings, were a standing reminder that authority depended at least on the acquiescence of the people. One of the best examples of a city with a life of its own, where people power has regularly spilled out onto the streets over the centuries, is of course Paris. Few centuries have gone by without their share of Parisian upheavals, from the 100 Years' War through to the 19th century barricades to the 20th century. And Adolf Hitler always hated Berlin, a place which stood for everything that he despised. Cities are very different from each other, of course, and cultures are different too. But cities have in common throughout the world that they are natural atmospheres for atomization, constantly tending to break down pre-existing structures and allowing new relationships to form and then reform. The atomism of modern urban and global society means that individuals have an ever wider range of perhaps ever shallower relations with other people. In more integrated pre-urban societies, individual self-awareness was a shared and socially shaped personality. In urban experience, individuals come more and more to perceive themselves as other than the relationship they have with the environment, with their environment. This is the new experience on offer now for more than half of humanity. It is, spiritually and psychologically speaking, both liberating and unsettling in the same sentence. So is the glass half full or half empty? The global bazaar, whose old and new embodiment the cities are, depends on the human instinct to trade. It first emerged thousands of years ago and has subsequently underpinned the connections, empires, technologies, luxuries, and yes, even the culture of the modern world. That trading instinct has led us into a world which, even to our recent ancestors, would have seemed a world of, for so many people at least, of unimaginable privilege. A world of growing freedom at the individual level as never before to transcend the bonds of poverty, ignorance, disease, psychological and social insignificance. A world where people can increasingly gather in great cities of millions, where every need or want can apparently be met one way or another. A world in which friends and families can be connected even across wide distances, year after year. A world where friendship can blossom as never before in history between people of different languages and cultures. Or is this only half the picture, and a very rose-tinted one at that? Is the truth not much more frightening? A picture of humanity sleepwalking to disaster, rather, dazed and drugged by its own self-indulgence. For we know how globalization and urbanization have also led to huge consumption of increasingly scarce natural resources, how humanity is putting more and more demands on a finite planet, how bitter poverty still shackles millions of people to brief lives of suffering and hopelessness, how the gap between those lives and those of the wealthy has got ever wider, how for even those who live in relative comfort, there's a price to pay for the cars and the flat-screen TVs, in the shape of the threat of loneliness, and perhaps even the nagging fear that it all may amount to nothing. And we know that there are still deep clashes, of course, in the world between different worldviews that stubbornly resist reasoned debate and which inspire the terror attacks, the suicide bombings, and so forth. So, if globalization and urbanization are progress, it is certainly ambiguous progress, to say the least. In particular, as we live through the aftershocks of a financial and economic crisis which was the worst, is the worst for several generations, globalized market capitalism is in the dock as it has not been for a generation. Wherever we are, this is certainly not the New Jerusalem. And we agonize, I would suggest, over four basic questions. One, is the global marketplace intrinsically unstable? If so, what do we do about it? How do we police the world's commerce? Second, what are the marginalized who are left behind or crushed by the momentum of all of this? Third, can our finite planet cope with all of this? And fourth, and underlying all of the above, where does the individualization lead? What does it do to our sense of value, of rights, of duties, of belonging, of who we are? Now, I don't have time, in the amount of time allocated to me by Ken, to try and answer all of those four questions. I'm going to limit myself mainly to a few thoughts on the first one and on the last one. The first one about the sustainability and stability of the global marketplace, and the last one about value and values. So, first, on the future of the global marketplace, or to put it another way, what the new world order will look like in the wake of the crisis we're living through. And on this, I think there are certain realities that it would be as well for us to recognise. I think we probably need to recognise, to start with, that there's no serious alternative to a significant role for the markets. At its worst, the market is unjust, abusive, destructive, and crisis-prone. At its best, it is a highly efficient allocator of capital and has delivered huge benefits to much of humanity. And furthermore, the stark lesson of the 20th century is that we do know what the alternatives look like. It isn't just a theoretical question. Churchill's famous defence of democracy quotes the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time, can, I think, be applied equally well to the global market. It is the worst engine of economic and social development. except for those that have been tried from time to time. And in any event, we cannot turn the clock back, either to recent times or to more distant times. We cannot go back to the 1970s, say, before the radical globalization of markets. The genie is out of the bottle now, and the sorts of restrictions on economic and financial activity, which were then normal even in developed countries like this one, would not now be considered compatible with an open society. Nor can we go back further to some, quotes, golden age of simpler, more communitarian, less connected living. I think that is completely unrealistic in what is now a densely populated, urbanized, communicating world. But it follows, if the Churchillian defense is applicable, that government oversight, regulation, and at times intervention are going to be essential. The notion that the markets could police themselves or that they were self-stabilizing is plainly nonsense. Market fundamentalism, that is to say, the notion that markets are efficient, stable, self-regulating and fair, is surely now dead. They cannot be left to themselves. On their own, they're unsafe. But how to regulate them and when to intervene? The underlying challenge for the next generation will be whether an interconnected world where no man, no country is an island, can construct a shared vision of a global economic order which preserves the dynamism and creativity of market forces whilst taming their excesses and inequities. International frameworks will certainly be needed to deal with markets which have become irreversibly porous. And there is simply no alternative to the painful and painstaking process of international consensus building and coordination. And key to this, finally, will be an acceptance that the balance of power globally is shifting from the centre, from the west to the east. The centre of gravity is shifting, and one thing that the crisis has not changed is that fact. If anything, it's accelerated it. The world's centre of gravity, to repeat, moving from west to east and also from north to south. This, too, is an event of historic significance. Only twice, you might argue, in human history has the world stage been dominated by one single global superpower. Once from 1815 to 1871, you can debate the end date, but around then, from the fall of Napoleonic France to the unification of Germany. For that brief period, Britain was the global superpower. And once from 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, to about now. The developed world, the truth is having to make space on the global stage for newly powerful, what we call emerging economies, but are in fact re-emerging ones. China was the largest economy in the world in about 1820. And we're beginning to see the outworkings of this in the complex discussions in new fora, the G20 notably, discussion in the IMF and in the WTO and so forth are all being increasingly affected by this new array of presences on the world stage, and quite rightly too, of course. The future of the financial markets, progress on world trade, consensus on climate change, all of these vital questions have to be exhaustively, and one might add exhaustingly, thrashed out in a world forum whose members are now very diverse. There is no going back, and there are no simple answers. Can we have faith in the global marketplace in this context? My answer is, as I've suggested up front, yes and no. The yes is partly because, at its best, it is very effective, and there is no serious alternative. The no is because it can't be left to itself. Then there's the second question about value and values in the global marketplace. And I want to spend my remaining few minutes on this one, because of its obvious relevance to anyone working in a modern society, and particularly to those who work within this square mile where Gresham College sits. How can we maintain faith and a sense of values in a globalised marketplace is a question for many, many of us. None of us can duck it, in fact, because we're all engaged, directly or indirectly, in the global marketplace. Whatever we do in this country, almost, we are dependent on a global marketplace operating to provide us with what we take for granted in our lives in so many ways. We either work in it or we benefit from it. None of us can sit in an ivory tower. But in particular, of course, those who have spent their careers in business and particularly in banking, such as myself, cannot take the view that it's none of our business. Because in recent years, society has allowed the market to take over our values too much. We've succumbed too much to that market fundamentalism, which holds that the value of everything is its price. If I have a product to sell and a contract and it's legal, then I don't have to ask any other questions about value or suitability or fairness, right? So goes the credo of market fundamentalism, and we've seen what damage it's done. Our challenge, made all the more pressing by a huge breakdown of public trust in recent years, is surely to recognise the values on which value, i.e. long-term sustainable shareholder value, depends. You might ask the question in the following form: are values and shareholder values in conflict? Are profit and social responsibility of businesses in conflict? I think the answer is only if maximising shareholder value is interpreted as a short-term goal. Although it is certainly true that boards and managements have often been pressured to do exactly that, and some of the results of such pressure are now plain for all to see. The response surely has to be a renewed commitment to the real task of sustainable value maximisation by those to whom shareholders entrust capital. And it's clear that this has several elements. First, there is, of course, the direct and basic responsibility to earn as good a return as is sustainably possible on the capital. And second, it's standard textbook wisdom that in order to do that, businesses need to nurture their customer relationships. But increasingly these days, this in turn requires them to demonstrate a wider commitment to the community and the environment. More and more, the customer is demanding that. The cynic might say that some of this is tokenism, or that it remains marginal in significance. But actually, given the tangled issues of globalisation, poverty and climate change, it would be wiser to see this as a rising tide. Furthermore, there is widespread evidence that it is not only customers whose demands are changing. The fact is that the vast majority of people, I believe, want to see themselves and the work that they do, the businesses that they're in, as in some way making a contribution to the common good. They may not articulate that very clearly, but at the depths of their being, I believe that to be true for the majority of us. It's abundantly clear, for example, as any business with a regular graduate recruitment program will know, that the next generation of management demands to know what the policies of the company are for meeting these social, environmental challenges. One way and another, the older, simpler idea that the sole job of business is to create profit has proved insufficient to sustain value and, in the end, a bad deal for shareholders. Sustainable profit and corporate social responsibility are not in conflict. They are, in fact, interdependent. And what has all this got to do with me, one might ask, the individual? There is, in other words, the challenge of what might be described, in parallel to corporate social responsibility, about which much is spoken and written, an individual social responsibility. And there are, I would suggest, only two possible responses to that challenge. One is to shrug our shoulders. The other is to listen to the still small voice of conscience. The voice that reminds us that something is always owed by the better off, the more comfortable. And a debt not paid makes a debtor who is guilty. Hence that voice. We often hear the well-off saying that they want, quotes, to give something back to the community. I've often heard it said of people who have retired from the city that they want to, quotes, give back something to the city. That very phrase conveys a sense that something is owed. At its worst, this may mean nothing more than doing what is expected or because it wins social points. The sorts of things that Augustus Melmotte did in that wonderful Trollope novel, The Way We Live Now. At its best, though, a different and a deeper form of transaction takes place, because the giver discovers that his or her spirit becomes involved and that the debt is not just being repaid, but forgiven. And the forgiven debt can bloom into a sense that the debtor is forgiven for all of the imperfections through which the affluence may have been generated, and for all of the presumption that it may have generated in its time. This response, of course, challenges the whole person. It can't be limited and compartmentalized, e.g., just by writing checks. And the more the whole person is involved, the more we discover an old truth about giving and receiving and about redemption and renewal. To borrow and adapt words that are associated with a figure from medieval times who can seem impossibly remote from our own modern urban life experience, St. Francis of Assisi, we will discover that it is in giving that we are forgiven and in forgiving that we truly receive. So can we maintain our values in a globalizing and obviously imperfect marketplace? My answer is yes, but. Because three things stand out about all this sweep of human commercial history that I've been floating over. One is, of course, that all human experience is shot through with imperfection. The perfectionism that characterized 18th and 19th century thought in different ways, we now know is really rather naive. The snake is there in the garden, the tares are amongst the wheat. In any realm of human activity, from the family to social relationships to business relationships, we're led to say, at our best, at our worst. And so far as the global market is concerned, there is, at its best, no more powerful engine for development and liberation, and at its worst is a dangerous moral pollutant which nourishes some very poisonous weeds in us all. Secondly, what of the end game of globalization? Our sense of ambiguity and perplexity, our sense of mounting challenge is not in fact new by the standards of longer perspectives on human history, but is very vivid now. There's a very widespread sense that we're riding a tiger and we don't quite know how to get off. There's a widespread sense of system overload. How are we going to rise to all of these complex challenges which seem to be hurtling down the pike at us very quickly over the next few decades? But this isn't all either. For beyond the ambiguity about human nature and about the end game of globalization, there is a third and enduring motif of human spiritual expression, you might say, which is directly relevant to our interpretation of and response to the global marketplace. For again and again, amidst disappointment and in the face of the sense of mounting difficulty and in the teeth of what seems to be the evidence, the human experience is that hope shows its face. Based on what? We could spend the rest of the evening talking about. But just as a matter of human socio-psychological observation, and one of the classic texts on this, by the way, I remember reading when I was an undergraduate, and I've still got it on my shelves and occasionally pick it out, Ernst Bloch's classic Principle of Hope. It's there somehow. The French Revolution was the great epoch-making event of the European history, and you had Wordsworth writing soon after it, bliss it was that dawn to be alive, to be young was very heaven. The hopes were never fully vindicated, of course, to say the least. No one quite knows what all of the outworkings are. Famously, Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China under Mao, when asked by a journalist what the consequences of the French Revolution were, said, "It's too soon to tell." But the hopes never quite extinguished either. If the late 18th and early 19th centuries were Europe's new dawn, well, now it's the new Asia that's got a distinct sense of a new dawn about it. There's much discussion, of course, in the commentary about the way economies and societies are organized about the Asian way. Actually, in the 80s and early 90s, it was the Japanese way that attracted all of the attention. More recently, it's been the Chinese way, or sometimes just more generally, the Asian way. And writers like Kishore Mahbubani in Singapore, writing very punchy books on calling into question Western norms of governance, Western approaches to human relationship, Western approaches to education. I feel like repeating sometimes when I talk to him, and I know him well, or read his books, or to other people when they're banging that particular drum, rather as Chou En-lai said, it's a bit too soon to tell. Does this add a further layer of complexity to the whole question of values and value? Does it add a question about the values themselves? Perhaps they're not universal. Are they different from one culture to another in a way that makes it even more difficult to build a meaningful human consensus? Who is to determine which the right ones are, if so? Can we really say that there's a universal standard of integrity for the world of commerce when it precisely is the meeting point of every creed, culture, and community under the sun? I think this line of questioning has more of the debating tactic about it than any practical significance. For what's striking about life in the global bazaar is just how widespread the consensus is about what it takes to do sustainable and ethical business. Individuals, as well as whole cultures, can and do, of course, disagree on profoundly important moral questions. And at a different level, philosophers may choose to debate whether there are any moral absolutes or universals at all. But as a matter of fact, the ethics of the marketplace are almost by definition universal, which is of course not to say that they're always upheld. But there are very few people in the marketplace who won't recognize the practical importance of trust and honesty for sustainable business. Everyone knows that though you can fool some people all of the time and most people some of the time, you can't fool all people all of the time, or even most of the time. Human psychology tells us, of course, that many will try, and this is repeatedly the case. But human psychology also tells us, or virtually all of us surely, that there is no way to enduring success or recognition or fulfillment, which most people at some level yearn for, that doesn't come with a commitment somehow to integrity based on honesty, trust, and a real desire to exchange value for value. All I'm claiming is that there isn't really a debate to be had about the ethics of the marketplace and their universal cross-cultural validity. There are other principles, of course, that follow from that, and again, if I had enough time, I would seek to kind of develop some of the thoughts about how that principle implies the way you treat people. People are ends and not just means. About the proper role of ambition. Plenty of people in business life have ambition. To what extent is that an acceptable objective for life? About life balance and the avoidance of compartmentalization, applying one set of standards to your family life and another to your business life and a third to your social life, and so on. About the real nature of leadership. What is interesting, and I don't have time to dwell on all of those questions, is how when you listen to what is coming out of the business schools, for example, not just in this country, in Europe, in the West, but actually around the world, it's a remarkably common story when ethics questions are being addressed. And then there's one final thing that I want to focus on because I think it is critical. Because experience is never perfect or unambiguous. Because business life, and actually all parts of life, are about shades of grey. Failure and wrong are the common human experience. And that's true in business as much as in other realms, whether acknowledged or not, whether it's serious or less serious. And there has to be a place in any healthy individual or any healthy society for the exercise of remorse, forgiveness, redemption, and renewal. The questions are there, of course, at spectacular points of failure. What happens when the young CEO of a public company who's been used to nothing but success in everything that he or she does is forced out because something has gone wrong in the company? What happens when the young trader in a bank dealing room covers up his losses with fictitious transactions until they spiral out of control and into the limelight? What happens to the up-and-coming politician brought down by a financial impropriety or a sexual misdemeanor? Or to the social worker who misses the evidence that leads to a death of somebody in their care? What happens? The rest of us may often have cause to say, there but for the grace of God go I, but the individual, what does he or she do? There's a whole variety of possible responses, of course: total or partial denial, depression, loss of self-esteem, even suicide in some extreme cases. Some go hard, others flee, others implode. But there's always another way, and surely that's part of any understanding of the values that we bring to a civilized society. There's always the way that consists of, for a start, recognizing what's happened or what you've done, secondly, sensing that you owe something, and then mysteriously learning through experience that in paying the debt, you receive far more than you ever imagined possible in your former life, and so on. The rewarding irony in all of this is that as we tackle those issues, we continue to learn and grow. We need to learn from what we do wrong, from the mistakes we make, from the failures we suffer. We learn from these experiences to the extent that we're able to offer and accept forgiveness and self-forgiveness. One way of describing this is that the prize is completeness of the human being. Actually, that would be misleading, because I don't think the prize is ever attainable. We can converge towards it. We will never completely attain it. It's easier to say it than do it. We know we will often stumble, but it is surely part of the common modern human experience too. So finally, can we have faith in the global marketplace? As I say, I think the answer is yes and no. Must we strive to maintain our values in the midst of the global marketplace? The answer is yes, but there's the challenge of commitment and of redemption where necessary. Thank you.
Let me say how impressed I was with your talk. It was I was expecting to come and hear more about finance than actual values, but it's really quite excited me. One thing this week is that it is actually we're currently Fair Trade Fortnight at the moment, which is actually the link between ethics and actually trade. Actually, it's actually going away from this idea of actually, just giving people charity to help them, but actually empowering them through trade. And I would say it is a challenge to what you were saying, because when the fair trade people started off, people said no one's ever going to pay extra for their goods. They just want it at the cheapest possible price. But actually, people have challenged that, and have linked in ethics that actually say, I do not want my prosperity to be built upon the suffering of others. And I was interested to see how strong you think that phenomenon is, if it's just a Western phenomenon or is actually passing elsewhere in the world, because it's obviously started here because we were prosperous enough to do it. Thank you.
First of all, I think you're right. It isn't just a transitory phenomenon. I think there's a momentum behind it. And lying behind that momentum is a growing consciousness on the part of consumers of what it takes to produce the goods that they consume, which is clearly a good thing with a capital G&T. What I don't know is to what extent there is a similar momentum in the Asian middle-class consumer markets, but I would be willing to bet that even if it's a bit behind Europe, if that be the case, this is a matter of time and not of different perceptions. And that you will indeed find growing consciousness of the importance of fair trade around the world.
Yes, I'm Stuart Wallace from the New Economics Foundation. I found it totally fascinating, and thank you. two sort of related questions. Would it be fair to interpret what you're saying that our task is to start making the market our servant rather than our master? So terribly important, I buy that. And secondly, linked to that, you said something like society has allowed the global marketplace to overwhelm our values. Could you say a bit more about why you think that's happened?
Yes.
What, is it a failure of economic myths? What is it? What do you think are some of the reasons for that's happened?
Yes, I do think that that headline thought that the market needs to be our servant and not our master is a very helpful one, because in a sense it is a good way of recognising that it's a mode of behaviour, it's a mechanism which, harnessed properly, can do a great deal of good, and out of control it is like a tiger that's trying to ride. Why did market fundamentalism become pervasive? And what I meant by that phrase was something quite specific. It was, first of all, technically that the market is the best and only useful measure of value. Wrong, I think, stated boldly like that. And secondly, an attitude to behaviour in the markets that said, if I've got a contract and it's legal and I've got a market, I don't have to make any other decisions about fairness or rightness or suitability. Now, I'm not sure that I know what the answer is to why that attitude spread through the markets. I do think we can trace the origins of the first proposition to effectively modes of economics, thought in the economics world, that trace their origins to, well, Milton Friedman for one, but it's not fair to single out one person. There was a more pervasive sense that the markets were the best allocator of capital and signals to the labour market, etc., that there were. And this just went to an extreme. And indeed, you will still hear some people talking in those terms.
If I can start by giving you a crumb of comfort for capitalism, I took part in a debate last night, and there was a 3-to-1 majority in favour of capitalism being the best system we have for all its imperfections. The question comes to you, really, on the question of investment. And if you buy shares in Berkshire Hathaway, you get a mission statement we used today from Warren Buffett explaining his investment philosophy, which tends, oversimplified, is I'm investing for a 10-year timescale. We had a lecture here in this room a few months ago where we were being extolled the virtues of ultra-rapid trading in fractions of a second. Now, have we moved from investing in a company to actually do something to having a casino game with other people's money? And is that the biggest danger facing capitalism today?
I think it's a very considerable issue. You don't need me to tell you that the average holding of a FTSE 100 share is shortened and shortened and shortened. The last time I looked, it was certainly less than 12 months. I'm not sure where it's got down to, or whether it's still getting shorter. I'm not sure about that. But plainly, somebody who on average, holds a stock for, let's say, 6 months for the sake of argument, is not going to be terribly interested in what that business is really doing. And that can't be healthy. I would make a case for some of the shorter-term trading activity, which has to do with the liquidity and lubrication of the markets. But very clearly, that got out of control. It became, Keynes had a wonderful quotation that some of you may remember, and I can only dimly remember, about the difference between the bubbles on the steady flow of investment and when investment becomes the bubble on a maelstrom of, I've got the quote wrong, but some of you will recognise it. And that drew attention to the fact you can have a certain amount of this, but when it gets too large in relation to the core responsibility of sustainable, long-term focused investment, something is awry.
Thank you. I just had a question on the question is whether, to what extent the government is responsible for setting the ethical standards that you are referring to, and rather specifically to your situation, is it correct for the UK government in particular to be using tax information, sorry, data stolen from your own bank, your previous bank, for its tax inquiries in this country?
Well, I'm certainly not going to comment on particular situations, not least of institutions of which I am now only a pensioner. I mean, what do I think governments should do? Do I think governments can set ethical standards? On the whole, no, I don't think so. Do they have a responsibility for the regulation and the laws within which society operates? And for encouragement of the right kinds of socially responsible behaviour? Yes, I think they do. I mean, you might argue, without wanting to get very far into all of the ramifications of this, that the concept of a big society was sort of that. What I certainly believe is that however well you do the regulation and the legislation, it will always be both necessary but equally clearly insufficient for the good society. I mean, in the context of the financial system, when you look at the lessons we need to learn from what happened, you know that there are some regulatory changes that need to be made and are being made. You also know that unless there's a change in attitudes amongst the practitioners, the regulations are always going to be insufficient.
We have our last question because I'm afraid we're running out of time.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lord Green, for the fantastic insight. My question is relating to your answer of yes and no relating to trust, and I think you allude to different governments and regulators will have to work together and try to have to work out, what might work, in the future. So my question is, what would be the catalyst for that to happen? Because unlike yourself and Mr. Costa here, you guys have been a career banker that were given a trust that you can run, company for quite a few years. Majority of the CEOs, and in fact government, and and prime ministers don't actually have that kind of luxury. So what would that catalyst be, or basis, or utopic?
Well, I think that international coordination of the public policy domain to deal with complex international social and economic problems is going to be one of the big themes for the next generation, for all the rest of our lives and beyond, our children's and our grandchildren's. And the range of issues they're having to address is both increasing and getting more complex. And it simply is the case that more and more of those actors on that scene are subject to other pressures. They are democratically elected governments, for example. They are businesses who have a part to play where the management is only there for a period of time, clearly. So we're all of the time wrestling with what I think is the challenge in your question, namely that any given person isn't with the issue long enough. That's a feature of modern life. I hope it's clear from everything I've been saying that on the whole I think the glass is half full and not half empty, and I do believe that as long as we keep at that, we will make steady progress. Whether we can make it fast enough vis-à-vis certain issues like climate change, I think is an open question. But on things like international financial regulation, I think a great deal of progress has been made over the last 4 years. So yes, I think it is possible to get things done. But I've participated myself in those kinds of international discussions enough to know how mind-bendingly complex and often tedious they can be as you seek painstakingly to build the consensus. Yet there's no alternative. There's no magic wand to be waved, and no dictator who can just say this is the way it's going to be.
Well, Steve, it's just left for me to say thank you very much indeed for being here. There are, as you can imagine, amongst the room, as many questions to be asked that we haven't got time for as you had posed for us as food for thought in the lecture that you've given. I commend again the book, Good Value, and there are so many of these questions that Stephen has raised that it's worth sort of looking again at the lecture, which is online and which you can hit there and let others know, tweet it, because I think the issues that were raised are very, very important and come from a practitioner rather than a theoretician although it was so rich in the philosophical quarry from which he drew so many of those seeds. So thank you very much, and shall we give him a warm round of applause?
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.